with intertribal workshops on climate variability and change. And we have the Oklahoma Climate Survey, the OCS, and SCCSC, which is the Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program. It's one of the RESAs. Since 2009, they've been undertaking some groups, working with some groups, some outreach, and talking about and asking after climate impacts assessment, drought monitoring and planning, water resource and supply and demand, and talking to some of the more marginalized communities in Oklahoma that may not be accessing the information products that are available, but might have some really important information about what's happening and transformations that they're experiencing, and what are their needs, and what are they experiencing, and how do you find that information. And this could be understood to have culminated in a December 12th, 2011 workshop, typo, that was at the National Weather Center, that brought together the OCS, Oklahoma Climate Survey, as well as SCCSC, pulling together with some resources and the National Climate Assessment, collecting some of that information. Also, the Haskell Indian Nations University, their Environmental Studies Center, was contributing to that. So in December, there was a workshop, and it brought together 22, I think, representatives from the 22 out of the 39 federally recognized tribes in Oklahoma. And it was a sort of a full-day affair where we had some educational outreach, and then we had lunch, and then we had some breakout groups, and just trying to get the conversation going. And again, building on previous conversations. And so it's important to realize that we're not inventing the wheel here, that there have been projects that we're initiating, and we're trying to learn from those experiences. But I've got a very particular perspective on this, and I just want to take a moment to point it out. I come from a humanities background. I have an undergraduate degree in history and about 7 different majors, of which were very visual before I discovered history. I ended up getting my master's in history of science from the University of Oklahoma, and that's where I tapped into feminist studies of technoscience, and that's just a fancy word for insisting that science today is technology-mediated, collective knowledge production. So technoscience. Then I discovered geography and went to the University of Kentucky, and their geography department was quite distinctive. I had a critical theory, critical social theory. Feminist thought was just sort of in the air. Everybody breathed it. Marxist ideas, thinking about social inequalities, so social justice, what kind of academic praxis can contribute to progressive changes. And I have a post-colonial perspective on the geopolitics of representation, a lot of fancy words, but that means I'm constantly trying to be mindful of who's representing whom, and who's speaking for whom, and who's participating in accessing the technologies of representation to be a part of the conversation about something like climate change, climate variability, and needing information and having experiences to share. So my methodological toolbox, if you will, I undertake ethnographic inquiry. That means I spend a lot of time hanging out, talking to people, interviewing, not surveys, but interviews, repeated interviews, life story sort of interviewing. And I've undertaken organizational ethnographies. That means I spend a lot of time looking at particular organizations and trying to see what their geographies are. I did for my dissertation research, for example, I looked at a small media NGO down in the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca. And who were they working with? They were working with transnational foundations and national agencies, government agencies in Mexico, but they also had very close ties to community organizations. And so they were sort of the monkey in the middle, and they were studying them allowed me to see what some of these transnational geographies of advocacy, for example, that were making access to video technologies and the skills to use them in that southern Mexican state with indigenous communities. So that's my perspective on this. And I'm coming from University of Oklahoma, and I'm the department colleagues like Chia Saki-Kawara, who has worked with the Polar Research Division of NSF and is very much a humanities-oriented researcher as well, and worked with Inuit communities in Point Barrow, Alaska, and trying to get a grasp of what their experience of climate change is and what they're doing to adapt in terms of cultural adaptation, as well as pick up and move communities. And our department's in the College of Atmospheric and Geographic Sciences, which is kind of a strange location for some geography departments. Not a lot of universities have a college like that. But it really creates some interesting synergies, and that's where I can connect with folks with the climate survey, with SCIP, with the National Weather Center, the weather enterprise that happens down there on the South End campus. But also connecting with, we have a Center for Social Justice on campus. And Clemencia Rodriguez, just didn't even get a last name there, sorry. Treating her like Cher. But she's a world-renowned expert on community-based alternative media, the sort of small-scale media in places like Colombia and elsewhere. We also have a growing cluster of researchers who identify with anthropology, but they're interested in mediated indigenous geographies, and they tap into film and media studies. And we have a Natural History Museum that has a Native American language fair every year, and they've undertaken video workshops as well. So these are some of the folks that I'm learning from now, I'm connected to now, and moving forward would like to undertake larger projects as well. And also I've got family ties. The cameraman here today is Philo, and he's actually my husband, and he is, if you're looking at that piece of paper, he's that outside consultant. He is a Mixe man coming from the Mixe region in the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca. And if you go to Native Networks, which is the Smithsonian's fabulous website that's in English and in Spanish and looks at indigenous peoples' media, radio, in particular video and film. And if you go to Esuma TV, and you can find his video there that's been recognized. So these are some of the factors that shape my research and, in turn, this particular project. So from my perspective, when I take a look at the Climate Science Center and I see what's going on, I see two important things. We have research going on where people are inquiring after impacts, mitigation, and adaptation, and learning some challenging lessons, right? We're having to learn to listen in new ways, and we're having to learn to be respectful for different storytelling narrative styles in order to get at what people are experiencing and how they might be changing their life to deal with those environmental transformations that they're encountering. And also these meshworks, these new entities, these startups that are bringing together new government agencies and new government agencies that are looking to work together with universities and with nonprofit entities or NGOs as well, and the sort of amateur people that are collecting data today. And this is new for the way that techno-scientific enterprise has unfolded historically in the United States, and I'm really interested in that. And we're having to learn how to invite folks together and talk about some of these issues, these pressing issues like global climate change, and on the landscape and the regional scale, climate variability, how do we grapple with that, what do you need to know to prepare? And we're seeing a push to diversify institutions of knowledge production. For example, I happen to be in town because this weekend is the Southwestern Division of the Association of American Geographers. Our SWAG meeting is happening. Eric Shepard is the president of SWAG at this year. And he's recently written some really great editorials in our AAG, the Association of American Geographers newsletter, where he's talking about geography at large needs to diversify. We have appalling numbers in terms of underrepresented groups have been marginalized from disciplines like geography and STEM disciplines as well. And we're having to rethink the way a professional society operates, what kind of opportunities can take place by changing the way that we undertake research and also the way that institutions are working together. And this is anybody that's put together an NSF proposal, for example, knows that if you're a natural scientist or a life sciences person, it's increasingly difficult to get funding, and this includes NASA and NOAA as well, without talking about social impacts. They want to know, where's your social scientist, right? So who are you bringing on board, and then how do you get social scientists to talk to natural scientists as well? So I'm really interested in these sorts of conversations, and with a particular focus on indigenous communities. And how can you mediate conversations between indigenous communities and scientific communities? Which led to the project, you've got that little slip of paper there, the intertribal workshops. We've got a series of workshops that will be unfolding, and there is a dual approach to those. We'll have an element of outreach, which is not terribly different from today's presentations, what's going on in our region in terms of climate variability and change, so trying to share information, and also a little bit of promotion happening. If we can turn people from marginalized communities onto the STEM disciplines, then that is going to be useful for their communities as well. But we're having to change the way that we promote how we represent the STEM disciplines. There's transformations happening all over. And I've got to point out that geography is an extraordinary discipline, and where the climatological and the cultural coexist in ways that don't necessarily happen in other disciplines. Anthropology sometimes comes close. We both have the same colonialist history we have to deal with, that baggage in the room. But we got this spatial element that, anyway, sorry. It's like OSU and OU, or football, Texas Tech, sort of disciplinary debates. So we have an outreach component to these workshops. But we also have a conversation. As I pointed out, we're building on previous projects. We're asking questions so that we can document impacts. We can ask after knowledge needs. What sort of knowledge products might help you make some decisions? What kind of planning strategies? What kind of information do you need to undertake those practices? But also recognizing a key starting point is that concepts of risk and resilience, or vulnerability, which is a little more of a political hot potato, especially when you're talking with indigenous communities. But how do you do that without imbuing the conversation with cultural values? Right? There is, for one definition of risk, people coming from different cultural or social locations might define risk differently. Okay, so how can we maybe have a pluricultural conversation about climate change or climate variability? And how can we bring climate, oh, here's a failed sentence completion there, but it was tribal representatives, we have climate scientists, as well as people working at the LCCs, for example. How can we all get together and have this conversation? And we're going to be enormous a range of people, and we need to think about how that conversation happens. And a key element in these workshops we're undertaking next summer is initiating a dialogue, taking that very first step to meeting some folks in communities that are maybe environmental representatives or environmental scientists representing tribal communities, but also tribal members, and asking them to what degree they might be interested in a participatory video project. Would you like to produce a video together, which of course means introducing this concept of participatory video and what its aims might be and what its practices and what kind of institutional organizational geographies make participatory projects possible when working with indigenous communities. And my work has historically unfolded in Mexico. And so instead of standing here and telling you what I think participatory video projects with indigenous communities might be, I would like to show you the first minute in a video called Historias Verdaderas, or True Stories. This is a video that was made, it's only 12 minutes long. I'm just going to show you the first opening minute montage. It was made in 2003 by that media collective I worked and studied with down in Oaxaca. It's Ojo de Agua Comunicación. And the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian and have a film and video center. And in 2003, they organized Video Mexico Indígena, or Video Native Mexico. It was a tour, and it went to different parts of the United States through universities and museums, and it was showcasing and screening some of the videos made by indigenous media makers in Mexico. And this opening, I think, does a really good job of talking about what video is and what it can do for these sorts of communities.
Nuestros padres y nuestros abuelos eran los que alrededor del fogón de la cocina nos contaban la historia de nuestros pueblos, las leyendas, los cuentos, y a través de ellas nos transmitían conocimientos. Actualmente, la televisión ha usurpado ese lugar. El video indio tiene que ser muy realista y muy participativo. Poner en ese espacio lo nuestro, que los niños se vean ahí, que los ancianos también se puedan ver ahí.
Uno cuando hace un video es porque lo siente, ¿no?
Uno tiene que plasmar lo que uno piensa, lo que uno cree. Quiénes somos, qué hacemos, cómo vivimos, cuáles son nuestras historias verdaderas. Yeah.
Okay. By and for their communities has to be participatory, and it provides them a medium to articulate their knowledge, to express their experiences in ways where you have different literacies characterizing these communities. And in southern Mexico, there's no guarantee that people will speak Spanish very well. For example, Philo, English is his third language. He learned Spanish in public school. And lots of folks like that, especially women, right, are not going to be less likely to speak Spanish, much less read and write Spanish. So video has a medium that can travel to different communities, and video can be really awkward for anybody in front of the camera. I'm sweating a little bit more than usual because there's one in the room today. I don't know if anybody else experienced that. Right. It changes the dynamic, right? But also moving media and a visual medium. And you know what? It's uncomfortable for climate scientists in the same way it is for community representatives. But video is jazzy and snazzy, and it can travel in ways. You can take a DVD and a DVD player and maybe an outdoor projector and project in a community where it's nice to have electricity, right? But that can often be a minimum requirement. The same video can go to an isolated community and be shared. That same video can go online and stream into classrooms at all levels of education. And it can also go to Geneva, Switzerland, to the World Wildlife Federation headquarters, for example, or the World Bank. There are different places. So it's got this extraordinary mobility, and it can amplify voices that have not been participating in some of these really important conversations. So, and also it forces climate scientists to maybe think about communicating their knowledge in a slightly different way, and not just climate scientists, but all sorts of researchers. And can we do it a little more visually? And can we do it visually, sort of incorporating graphs or remotely sensed images, for example, and maps in particular? But can we make those move? How can animation help us convey important aspects of the conversation? So these are just some of the ideas. But participatory video or participatory research, to begin with, takes an extraordinarily different time scale. It does not move as quickly as we like to think research happens. This is the workshops, and I'll talk a little bit more about those workshops in just a second. This is not a short-term project. You have to introduce yourself to communities. You need to spend time with those communities. They need to know what sort of work you've been doing, your motivations for wanting to work with them. And participatory research means that those communities you're working with, they lead on what this video might look like. This might be young people in communities that through video might be learning something that they hadn't found interesting before, and that could inform educational and career decisions later on down the road. It might get young people talking to elders in the community, that they might end up recording what some of the older folks in their community might have to say or to do, so that this pluricultural, this intergenerational conversation, and again, these are lessons that researchers of all flavors are having to learn, that top-down research objectives don't necessarily accomplish what you're looking for. So this sort of ground up, working with stakeholders and letting them lead on particular projects. So I talk about video in my academic publications. I talk about reconfiguring the cultural geographies of technoscience. And we have new actors that are increasingly participating in techno-scientific conversations. Not suddenly, the last 20 years or so, this traditional ecological knowledge, or environmental knowledge, for example, people are very interested in that. What do we need to know about it? How can we learn from it? And how can we continue to have conversations with the folks that produce some of that? And increasing access to technologies of representation. My research asked the question, what happens when people who have traditionally been the subjects of scholarly inquiry are now representing themselves with new authoritative technologies, and not just video technologies, but also visualization mapping technologies. What might they do with remotely sensed images, for example, that might be a little bit different? And the key focus of these workshops is the starting point. We may find that nobody in these communities are necessarily interested in climate change per se, but how do we visualize environmental transformations? How do we think about that historically? How do we grapple with what's happening today? And how do we envision what the future is going to look like? And how are we going to envision coalitions and collaboration to talk about planning or mitigating or adapting to these transformations that are happening? And this idea that video might help us undertake some of these pluricultural conversations that are happening. So what are we doing next summer? We've got 6 workshops that are tentatively located in these different locations. We'll do 4 in Oklahoma. One will be with the Chickasaw and the Choctaw Nations, bringing them together. And you'll notice that we've got some groups here that are very different shapes and sizes and very different sorts of locations. And that's because this is a pilot project. We want to get a sense of what's going to work best. Working with a smaller tribal entity up in northeastern Oklahoma, for example, where they have environmental scientists that work and represent, work in and work with, and are from the Eastern Shawnee in Miami. But they also have working relationships with other environmental scientists representing different tribal entities up in that corner and bringing them together. We have Randy Pepler, who is an atmospheric scientist who just completed his PhD in cultural geography and native weather knowledge, and he was working out sort of central western Oklahoma in that county there. So we'll be building on his research contacts. And then Oklahoma State University has some environmental sociologists that have been working with the USDA on Native American communities and food security, right? So that might be a different sort of coalescence of people coming together and talking, again, that two-prong approach to these workshops. We have some outreach going on and also starting some conversations, asking after and documenting the climate impacts and the mitigation. 2 workshops in New Mexico, and folks from New Mexico, I'd love to hear what you think. Right now, when we look at where most of the tribal entities are located in New Mexico, we've worked with these 2 locations, the Navajo Technical College in Crown Point and the Northern New Mexico College in Hispaniola. I'm not sure, with the Enye or the N? Okay, Hispaniola. We thought these might be with the idea of neutral sites where different folks might come together, and if anybody's connected to these institutions, please don't be offended. We haven't formally approached them and seen if this is something they're interested in, right? So this is where just trying to pinpoint where ballpark ideas, where we might get the most folks that might want to come and learn a little bit something, maybe something new, but also to share their experience and their histories, and maybe start this conversation about what a video project might look like. And I have, in Oklahoma, there is an extraordinary group of young people called the 1491s. Has anyone heard of the 1491s? Yeah? Have you seen their videos?
Yeah.
Do you enjoy them?
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
They bring humor, but they're not just Oklahoma-based. Some of the key media makers are in Oklahoma, but they've got Native Americans that are studying out at Dartmouth and all points where Native American communities are living and working today. And they make videos that are very sharp critiques of the way that Native American people have been represented and coming up with some of their own representational strategies. So if you just do an internet search on the 1491s, you can find some of their work. And I was real interested in hopefully getting them to come to these workshops where they might want to connect with some of the folks and what might happen talking about climate change and climate variability if you infuse it with a sense of humor that might work, might be really, make it more palatable or more attractive to young people in Native American communities today, for example. And I understand, recently went to a Film Forward Institute that's part of the Sundance Institute, and there was a Sundance writing lab representative, and he's up Albuquerque way. He's originally from Oklahoma, but he's from Albuquerque, and he was talking about a lively group of young media makers from indigenous communities that are living in Albuquerque. And I've sent out emails. Maybe I'm not coming across my emails the right way, but anyway, it's a long-term conversation. You try to approach folks, and they don't know who you are. You're sort of coming out of the blue. So hopefully, we might be able to connect to some of those folks as well. Media makers who are already working with their communities and coming up with sharp and insightful work. So, this is the sort of money sentence, if you will, when you're writing up your summary or your mission statement for a research project. We want to blend educational outreach with preliminary research on how tribal members know and conceptualize weather and climate, as well as how Native American communities have grappled with transformations in the past and how they've had to adapt to new climate conditions. By blending this together, by trying to weave these together, we want to facilitate the design of products that can be used by these sorts of folks, and also to help monitor climate change in the field by working with these communities that may have not been historically key voices in conversations about what's happening, conservation questions as well. And our project aims to provide lessons about adaptation that are useful for both tribal and non-tribal communities and businesses that might appreciate science being communicated in, I don't have a magical formula, a box that we can put science into and have it come out the other end as something that is more accessible and understandable. But we can start working toward that conversation. And we've chosen to start by building on my research in Mexico, but also drawing on the really strong climate science consortium and that community that's starting to come together through entities like the LCCs. And so this is the point where I'm supposed to have the slide where I say Laurel Smith. My email is laurel@ou.edu. That makes it a little bit easier. I suppose I should have it here. I do have some business cards if you'd like those. That's very old school, isn't it? But thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to field them.